Private John Riley clutched his rifle, its cold steel a familiar comfort against his clammy palm. His heart pounded a heavy rhythm against his ribs, a drumbeat of fear he tried to ignore. War was a monstrous thing, swallowing men whole and spitting them out as hollow shells. John had seen it firsthand, the way it leached the light from a man's eyes, leaving behind only a haunted emptiness. He was young, barely a man, but war had a way of aging you fast, forced to grow up too quickly, thrust into a world of violence and despair. John wasn't sure he was cut out for this life, this dance with death. But he was here now, on the front lines, duty shackling him to this living nightmare. The air hung heavy, thick with the metallic tang of blood and the acrid bite of gunpowder. John closed his eyes, trying to block out the horrific symphony of war that raged around him. He longed for home, for the simple life he had left behind. The battlefield stretched before him, a desolate wasteland scarred by the ravages of war. Craters pockmarked the earth, gaping wounds oozing smoke and ash. Twisted metal carcasses of tanks and trucks littered the landscape, grim reminders of the brutal efficiency of modern warfare. Overhead, the sky churned with a sickly yellow light, the sun a pale ghost struggling to pierce the dense smoke that choked the air. John's unit was entrenched along a low ridge, a meager defense against the enemy onslaught. Sandbags formed a haphazard wall, providing scant cover from the relentless hail of bullets and shrapnel. He crouched low, his helmet scraping against the dirt, feeling every tremor of the earth as another explosion ripped through the air. He was just one man, a tiny cog in the vast, unforgiving machine of war. Beside him, Sergeant Miller, a grizzled veteran with eyes that had seen too much death, barked orders. His voice, roughened by years of shouting above the din of battle, was a reassuring presence in the chaos. John had come to rely on Miller's experience, his gruff exterior hiding a heart that still held compassion for the men under his command. Across the trench, Corporal Jones, a wiry young man from a small town in Kansas, nervously checked his ammunition. His face was pale beneath a layer of grime, his youthful features etched with a tension that spoke of the horrors he had witnessed. They were more than just comrades, these men who shared the horrors of war. They were brothers, bound by a shared sense of duty, a fierce loyalty forged in the crucible of combat. They had seen the best and worst of humanity together, had faced their own mortality side by side. But for now, they found strength in each other's presence, a silent promise to fight, to survive, to return home together. A sudden shift in the wind brought a new wave of terror. The stench of blood and gunpowder was replaced by a sickly sweet aroma. It clung to the air, thick and cloying like overripe fruit left to rot in the sun. John's stomach churned.
What the hell is that?
Gas masks on now.
As Sergeant Miller, his face grim, unhooked his gas mask from his belt. Soldiers scrambled, their movements frantic as they fumbled with their gas masks. The air grew thick with the ominous hiss of escaping breath as they secured the rubber masks over their faces. John struggled with his own mask, his fingers clumsy with panic. The sweet, sickening smell intensified, seeping into John's nostrils despite the mask. The fog, unnatural and swift, swallowed the battlefield. Visibility dropped to mere feet. John could barely see the man next to him. Panic edged into his throat, choking him. He fumbled for Sergeant Miller, his other senses heightened in the absence of sight. He bumped into someone, a solid form in the swirling green abyss.
"Sergeant?"
He called out, his voice muffled by the gas mask. The figure didn't respond. John reached out, his gloved hand landing on a damp, slick surface. He recoiled, his heart pounding. The fog pulsed around him, a living, breathing entity. The sweet smell intensified, triggering a wave of dizziness. John stumbled, his legs feeling weak and rubbery. A low groan reached his ears, guttural and inhuman. John ripped off his gas mask, gasping for air, desperate to escape the suffocating fog and the horrifying sound. He coughed violently, the sweet air burning his lungs. His vision swam, the fog taking on grotesque shapes that danced at the edge of his perception. He saw Sergeant Miller then, a few feet away, silhouetted against the swirling green mist, but something was wrong. Miller's body contorted, limbs twisting at unnatural angles.
"Sergeant, what's happening to you?"
Miller opened his mouth and a guttural roar erupted from his throat, a sound that seemed to tear through John's very soul. John watched in horror as Miller, or whatever he had become, lunged at Corporal Jones. Jones, caught off guard, cried out as Miller tackled him to the ground. The sound of bones crunching, sickening and sharp, cut through the fog. John wanted to scream, to run, to do anything but witness the gruesome scene unfolding before him. But his body, frozen in terror, refused to obey. He was trapped in a nightmare, forced to watch as his friend, his brother-in-arms, was torn apart by a monster wearing the face of their sergeant.
No, get off me!
The fog pulsed around them, a macabre stage for the horror unfolding within. John's stomach churned, bile rising in his throat.
John scrambled back, his mind reeling. This couldn't be happening. This was madness.
He turned and ran, his feet slipping on the muddy trench floor. The fog, thick and disorienting, clung to him like a shroud. He could hear the guttural roars of the transformed soldiers behind him, their heavy footsteps pounding the earth like thunder.
They were hunting him, their cries a symphony of madness and hunger. John didn't dare look back. He couldn't bear to see what they had become.
Shapes moved in the fog, grotesque silhouettes illuminated by flickering green light. The air vibrated with inhuman growls and the sickening crunch of bone on bone.
John dodged to the side as a shadowy figure lunged at him, its claws tearing through the air where his head had been a moment before. He didn't recognize the soldier, his face twisted into a grotesque mask of rage, but the feral glint in his eyes spoke of a hunger that chilled John to the bone.
This wasn't war anymore. This was something far more sinister, something that defied reason and sanity.
John raised his rifle, his finger trembling on the trigger. He couldn't shoot.
A blood-curdling scream pierced the fog, echoing through the trenches. John recognized the voice, Private Thompson.
He hesitated, his blood turning to ice. He couldn't leave Thompson to whatever fate awaited him in the fog.
John pressed himself against the trench wall, his back to the cold earth. He closed his eyes, trying to control his breathing, trying to shut out the sounds of the nightmare unfolding around him, but the screams continued, each one a fresh wave of terror washing over him. John stumbled upon a narrow communication trench, a lifeline in the suffocating fog. He ducked inside, the darkness a welcome relief from the swirling green mist. He leaned against the cool earth, his chest heaving, his body trembling with exhaustion and fear.
He couldn't outrun them forever. John knew he had to find a way to fight back, to defend himself, but the thought of turning his weapon on his own men filled him with a profound sense of dread.
A low growl echoed from the entrance of the communication trench, sending a shiver down John's spine. He wasn't safe, not even here. He peeked cautiously around the corner, his heart pounding in his chest. A figure emerged from the fog, its silhouette illuminated by an eerie green glow.
It was Sergeant Miller, his eyes blazing with a malevolent light, his teeth bared in a silent snarl. He moved with an unnatural grace, his body contorted, his limbs elongated, a grotesque mockery of the man he once was.
John stumbled back, his rifle clattering to the ground. John, his back pressed against the cold earth of the communication trench, knew he had only one choice. He couldn't fight his way out. The transformed soldiers were too strong, too fast, driven by a primal hunger that defied reason. He had to outsmart them, had to use the fog to his advantage.
He took a deep breath, the sweet, sickly air burning his lungs. His head swam with dizziness, but he pushed through it. He grabbed a grenade from his belt, the cold metal reassuringly familiar in his trembling hand. He pulled the pin, the hiss of escaping gas barely audible over the pounding of his heart. 3, 2, 1.
Section 2 through the Green Inferno.
John hurled the grenade towards the entrance of the communication trench, the explosion a deafening roar that shook the earth.
The fog, momentarily illuminated by a blinding flash of light, swirled violently, obscuring everything in a chaotic dance of green and grey.
He didn't hesitate. He charged into the swirling fog, his senses overwhelmed by the acrid smoke, the deafening roar still echoing in his ears.
He could hear the transformed soldiers, their guttural cries filled with confusion and rage as they stumbled through the thick smoke.
John kept his head down, his body low to the ground, pushing through the fog, his lungs burning with each desperate gasp of air.
Section 3, a trail of carnage.
He emerged from the smoke, his vision blurry, his head spinning.
He was in another section of the trenches, the air thick with the stench of blood and the sweet, sickly aroma of the fog. The ground was littered with bodies, their uniforms torn and shredded, their faces frozen in grotesque masks of agony.
John stumbled over a fallen rifle, the metal cold and slick against his palm.
He fought back the urge to vomit. These were his friends, his brothers in arms. The fog had taken them, twisted them into something monstrous, something inhuman. Section 4, the last stand.
He could hear gunfire in the distance, the staccato bursts of rifles, a grim counterpoint to the guttural roars of the transformed soldiers.
They were still fighting, still clinging to life. A surge of hope, fragile and fleeting, flickered within John's chest. Maybe, just maybe, there were survivors.
He followed the sound of the gunfire, his hand gripping the rifle tightly, his finger hovering over the trigger.
He rounded a bend in the trench and stopped dead in his tracks. A handful of soldiers, their faces grim and determined, were making a last stand against a wave of the transformed.
John didn't hesitate. He raised his rifle and fired, the sound of the shot deafening in the confined space of the trench. He felt a surge of grim satisfaction as one of the transformed soldiers stumbled back, a dark stain blossoming on its chest. "Over here!" he shouted, his voice hoarse but steady. "I'm with you!"
The remaining soldiers turned, their faces etched with a mixture of surprise and relief. John joined them behind their makeshift barricade, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and adrenaline. They were still trapped, still surrounded, but for the first time since the nightmare began, John dared to hope. They were not alone. They would fight together, and maybe, just maybe, they would survive this night. John and the remaining soldiers huddled together, a small island of humanity in a sea of green-tinged horror. They formed a tight circle, their backs to each other, rifles spitting fire into the swirling fog. Each muzzle flash illuminated the grotesque forms of their former comrades, now twisted mockeries of their former selves. The air crackled with the sound of gunfire, the sharp reports of the rifles, a stark contrast to the guttural roars that echoed through the trenches.
John fired blindly into the fog, his finger mechanically squeezing the trigger. He couldn't tell if he was hitting anything, but he couldn't afford to stop. To stop was to die.
The stench of gunpowder and blood filled John's nostrils, a grim reminder of the carnage surrounding them. He coughed, his throat raw, his lungs burning with each desperate gasp of air. The sweet, sickly aroma of the gas lingered, a constant threat that gnawed at the edges of his sanity. With each fallen comrade, John's hope dwindled. He saw the faces of the men he'd trained with, laughed with, bled with, twisted into masks of rage and hunger. He recognized Private Harris, his youthful face contorted in a silent scream, his hand reaching out as if begging for release. He saw Sergeant Miller, his eyes burning with a malevolent green fire, his once reassuring voice now a guttural growl. They were no longer men, but monsters, driven by a primal instinct that extinguished all traces of their humanity.
John felt a pang of sorrow, of loss, but it was quickly replaced by a cold, hard determination to survive. He wouldn't let their sacrifice be in vain. He would escape this nightmare, even if it meant carrying the burden of their memory forever.
The gunfire from the other soldiers began to falter, their movements sluggish, their ammunition running low. John knew they couldn't hold out much longer. They were outmatched, outgunned, fighting a losing battle against an enemy that knew no fear, no pain, no mercy.
"We have to make a break for it," a voice shouted, hoarse and desperate. "It's our only chance."
John looked up, his heart sinking. It was Lieutenant Davis, his uniform torn, his face streaked with grime and sweat. He was right. They couldn't stay here and die. They had to take a chance, however slim, however desperate.
"On my signal," Davis shouted, his voice barely audible above the din. 1, 2, 3, go, go, go."
John scrambled to his feet, his legs stiff and heavy from exhaustion. He didn't look back. He couldn't bear to see who fell, who was left behind. He charged into the swirling green fog, the screams of the fallen echoing in his ears, a constant reminder of the price of survival. He could feel the presence of the transformed soldiers all around him, their hot, fetid breath on his neck, their clawed hands reaching out to drag him down into the abyss. He ran blindly, desperately, his only thought to escape the nightmare, to outrun the darkness that threatened to consume him. The fog began to thin, the air clearing slightly. John risked a glance over his shoulder and saw that they were gaining some distance. Only a handful of the transformed soldiers were still in pursuit, their movements sluggish, their forms shimmering like heat haze in the fading light. He stumbled, his foot catching on a twisted piece of metal. He fell to the ground, his chest heaving, his vision blurring. He could see the exit from the trenches just ahead, a beacon of hope in the encroaching darkness. But as he struggled to his feet, a searing pain shot through his leg. He looked down and saw a deep gash, the flesh around the wound turning an unnatural green. The gas. He'd been exposed.
Panic surged through John. He had to get out, he had to warn the others, but his legs screamed in protest, the pain debilitating.
He looked back and saw the remaining transformed soldiers closing in, their eyes glowing with a predatory hunger. He was alone.
John raised his rifle, his finger trembling on the trigger. He knew what he had to do. He wouldn't let himself become one of them, a monster trapped in an endless nightmare. He would face the darkness on his own terms.
As the first transformed soldier lunged, its claws outstretched, John closed his eyes and squeezed the trigger. The sound of a single gunshot echoed through the desolate battlefield, a final mournful note in the symphony of violence. The green fog, as if disturbed by the sudden eruption of noise, swirled and pulsed, tendrils reaching out like ghostly fingers towards the heavens. A heavy silence descended, broken only by the crackle of burning debris and the distant rumble of thunder. The air, thick with the stench of blood and the lingering sweetness of the toxic gas, hung heavy over the trenches. Twisted metal and shattered bodies littered the ground, grim testaments to the battle that had raged just moments before. But there was no movement, no sign of life, only the eerie stillness of a world holding its breath. Then, from the depths of the trenches, a figure emerged, silhouetted against the fading light. He moved slowly, his gait unsteady, as if carrying an unbearable weight. His uniform was torn, his face grimy and streaked with sweat, his eyes hollow and haunted. John Riley stumbled through the remnants of the battlefield, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He could barely feel his legs, his body numb from exhaustion and the lingering effects of the gas. He had survived, but the victory tasted like ash in his mouth. He was surrounded by the ghosts of his fallen comrades, their faces twisted in death, forever etched into his memory.
He had lost track of time, lost track of everything but the primal need to survive. He didn't know how long he had been wandering through the fog, how many of his comrades he had been forced to kill to stay alive. He only knew that he had to keep moving, had to put as much distance between himself and the horrors he had witnessed.
He clutched his rifle tightly, the cold steel a meager comfort in the face of the overwhelming emptiness that surrounded him. The world seemed alien, unreal, as if he had stepped into a nightmare from which he could not awaken. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of his own ragged breathing and the pounding of his heart. He was alone. As he stumbled across the battlefield, the fog began to recede, revealing the full extent of the carnage. Bodies, both friend and foe, lay scattered across the landscape, their limbs twisted at unnatural angles, their faces frozen in grotesque masks of pain and terror. The air was thick with the stench of death, a heavy, cloying odor that clung to John's throat like bile. He averted his gaze, unable to bear the sight of his fallen comrades.
He had failed them. He had been unable to save them from the madness that had consumed them, had been forced to become a monster himself to survive. The guilt weighed heavily on his soul, a crushing burden that threatened to break him.
As he stumbled towards the horizon, his silhouette a lone figure against the setting sun, John knew that he would never escape the memories of this night. The horrors he had witnessed, the choices he had been forced to make would haunt him forever. He was a soldier, forever marked by the scars of war, both visible and invisible. He was a survivor, condemned to walk alone through the ruins of his former life. Like, share and subscribe for more chilling tales.